Welcome to the Build a Mind podcast. I'm Joel Thomas.
And I'm Kalen Folk.
And the Build a Mind podcast is brought to you by mcftools.net. MCF Digital's intelligence platform helps oil and gas operators and Bitcoin mining entrepreneurs evaluate stranded gas in three paths: sell it, electrify it, or mine Bitcoin with it. MCF Digital offers you 5 free calculators to thoroughly analyze any stranded gas site so that you can make the most profitable decision. Go run the math at mcftools.net. That's mcftools.net. And of course, if you want to learn more and dive into the Bitcoin mining industry, please check out our Telegram groups, which we are flashing on the screen, from the best deals to the best education. Anything and everything you could ever want to know is in those groups, and I highly recommend you take a look. So, Kalen, how you feeling? Good to see you.
Feeling good, man. It's been a little bit. Happy to be back.
Absolutely. I was gone all last week, so we couldn't quite get a pod in before I had left. But today we've got a really interesting podcast guest and one of my favorite people in the industry who's just so knowledgeable and fun to talk to. So we're going to talk to a bona fide self-custody expert in the field. So we're going to welcome Matt Cohen here from Unchained, the podcast. Matt, it's good to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to see you guys. How's everyone doing this week with the kind of crazy environment we're in right now? You know,
it doesn't even faze me. I bought as much as I possibly could last week, and then it went down 10,000, and I kicked myself and wish I would have had some more dry powder. Could have got a little bit more, but hey, it's okay.
No, you're a man after my own heart, Joel. I feel the exact same way. Very optimistic.
I can just never time the market. I don't know how you guys feel, but like some people, like my brother is like a chart bro. He looks at all this stuff and he's like, oh, we're 3 fibs and this. And I'm just like, look, that's cool. I'm just going to wait 20 years and keep buying. So
DCA is the way.
That is the way. Yeah. Most kind of mitigates the financial return, but also mitigates the risk. But I don't know, guys. I mean, I'm really, this is like peak bear sentiment right now. You know, it feels exactly like 2022. It feels exactly like 2018. We were talking a little bit before we hopped on here, but I don't know, all the negative sentiment, Kramer coming out and saying that, Bitcoin is dead. Oh man.
That's bullish as hell. The whole market's going to flip now.
Right. What happened to the inverse Kramer, man? I was waiting for it.
I know. Well, I mean, it's perfect. I mean, back in November, 120,000, things like that. He was talking about he really likes Bitcoin and now he thinks it's dead. And that's just like fires me up, makes me ready to run through a wall, So.
It does.
So why don't you give us your background and kind of tell us your Bitcoin story before we dive into the world of self-custody, institutional custody, all that crazy stuff. And I will mention that we did have a fantastic mastermind where we did we talked a ton about this topic in excruciating detail. You definitely should go check it out. And we even had a little discount code there for Unchained if you want to get into their custody services, which are some of the absolute best in the industry. So anyways, enough of me talking. Tell us your Bitcoin story, how you got into this.
Yeah. So I've been in Bitcoin since, late 2017 in that area. I mean, I think some people are kind of hesitant to mention exactly the date that they give into it. But at the time that I got in, I was just kind of like a broke college student. I was attending Texas A&M University and give you some context. My family are all kind of generational cattle ranchers and agricultural folks. My uncle was a professor of animal science at A&M. My dad was a professor of wildlife biology. And whenever I grew up on the ranch, and that was a really cool experience. But, when I started coming time for me to kind of graduate and kind of choose my own path, I kind of went to them and I said, hey, guys, if you could do it all over again, what would you do differently? And they both kind of gave me the same advice, which I kind of took to heart, which was don't go into academia as the short of it. Really just because, in academia, you think that you're going to be kind of chasing the research and the dream that you want to, and you're going to be able to kind of, forge your own path. But in reality, a lot of it is just chasing grants and chasing donors and, schmoozing people. And so they told me, they said, hey, go make the money first. And then, once you have the money, come back and chase your passions. And, at 17 years old, someone telling you to go make as much money as you could seemed like pretty good advice. So I got into economics at A&M and started learning all the Keynesian modern monetary, theory bullshit, if I can say that. Yeah, about 2017 in that area, I had a really good friend whose name is Andrew Fisher. He's over at BDC Inc. And he just was that crazy guy in the corner talking to me about Bitcoin, and I had a lot of conversations with him, and I kind of fell down the rabbit hole a little bit, and finally got to my final, I would say, capitulation phase, which I think is kind of the capitulation phases for everyone else is, okay, well, if this is so great, then the government's just going to ban it. And then, kind of went down the pathway of figuring out about torrenting and all that other stuff and the network effect. And since then, just, full on Bitcoin. And so I kind of radically shifted my perspective while I was still in college. Became a nightmare for most of my professors. Got kicked out of a couple classes, but fought the good fight. And then once I got out of college, went into sales to make money to buy Bitcoin. But was always looking to try to find a way into the actual industry as fast as I could. And so when Unchained had an application open, about 3 years ago now, which is kind of crazy to say, I just jumped on it and been loving it ever since. It's one of the best places to work, one of the best communities, some of the smartest people in the industry, and I love what I do. So.
Maybe give us like a brief description of what Unchained does for people who are not familiar with it.
Yeah, I would say, Bitcoin is kind of scary, right? And available pathways for a lot of people to kind of get into Bitcoin. I think a lot of people just kind of resonate with the fact that they feel like they don't know what they don't know. And so there's really two pathways that are kind of presented to you when you first get into Bitcoin. And, one of them is a custodial account at an exchange, and, all the counterparty risk that comes with that, as well as the convenience that comes with that. Right. And being able to kind of forego the risk of, losing it or making a mistake. But at the same time, always being kind of subject to the worries about, what are the financials of this company look like? And so, people, as the industry kind of touts, not your keys, not your coins, you move that off the exchange into self-custody. And then you've got a whole myriad of other problems, right? You've got worries about what if I make a mistake? What if I fat finger a transaction? And some of the more important ones that I really think people think about is, what happens if I have an unpredictable event, right? If I have like a fire or a flood in my house. Joel, I hate to keep bringing this up. Last time we talked, you had that water, spilling in.
I'm still dealing with it.
Are you really?
Yeah. They finished it, and I literally wrote a very nasty email to the builder today, and I'm, it's like being in a litigation without being a litigation. Every day you're waiting for the response, and then it disappoints you, and it's anyways. I don't want to dehorse you right now.
Yeah, well, that's the unpredictable event, right? That's the thing that you can't see coming. You don't know when you're going to kind of get tied up. And so, there's just lots of risks that come with, self-custody, in particular inheritance too, right? You've done all this work. We call it proof of work. We call it, low time preference, thinking about our family in the future. But I think a lot of Bitcoiners, when they actually get into self-custody, they start to worry about, what happens if I die, how is my family going to get access to this Bitcoin? And more importantly, how is it titled, and all these other kind of, granular details that come into play when Bitcoin intersects with the broader financial ecosystem. And I would say Unchained is the intermediary between those two worlds, right? And in between kind of the exchange where you don't, you have counterparty risk, and then, in between self-custody where you have all the risk on yourself. And so Unchained, we use collaborative custody to make it easy, right? Where if you make a mistake, if something happens, we like to say there's no single points of failure. There's not one thing that's going to, happen that's going to cause you to lose access to your Bitcoin. So it's, try to make it, the longevity of it better, and as well as just make your life easier, just bring some peace of mind. So
what do you think some of the biggest mistakes Bitcoiners make doing self-custody? And maybe another question to branch off that's kind of in the same ballpark is like, what do you think the biggest barrier to entry is for understanding self-custody? Because that's the thing. Like when I talk to my dad, I'm like, Bitcoin, and I'll just lay it out for like 2 hours straight, and he'll have to listen to me because he's my dad. And he'll be like, okay, well, I'm afraid to like custody something digital, like it makes him nervous, which is weird because he was a computer programmer. So what do you think, like I said, I'll reiterate the questions, like the biggest barrier to entry for understanding self-custody and the biggest mistakes Bitcoiners make during self-custody?
Yeah, so I would say, it was good questions, by the way. Probably the biggest barrier to entry is radical sovereignty, to the point that you just made, in that, your dad is a computer programmer and it's still, hesitant to even hold, Bitcoin in self-custody. I think a lot of people aren't familiar with the idea of actually being in charge of an asset, and actually being its, safe guardian and in control of it. And, that the decisions you make have a very real impact into, the overall outcome in the future. And so I would say that psychological barriers, definitely a barrier to entry. I would also say too, and a lot of people, and this is more of like a personal vendetta, maybe people at Unchained feel similar, but a personal vendetta against kind of how the market is developed surrounding hardware wallets, in that we call them hardware wallets, right? Which insinuates that the Bitcoin lives on this device,
Yep.
that's actually contained within the device, and that's actually not true, right? This is actually more of like what we call a wallet for keys, in that it stores a copy of your seed phrase, and is a storage and transaction method. It helps you sign a transaction to move Bitcoin on the blockchain, kind of like for some of the old heads in the audience, like you're endorsing a check, right? It's your digital signature. And so I think that a lot of people have this feeling that, if I'm going to put my net worth, my Bitcoin, or my store value into this little device, how do I trust this device? And actually, feel confident in being able to use it for the long term. And I think that, that's a significant barrier for most people. It's just, those two things in conjunction just really kind of prevent people from wanting to take that dive into Bitcoin, which in my opinion is actually kind of interesting, because it seems to, I would say, be juxtaposed against the reason why Bitcoin is valuable in the first place, right? I mean, if you look at like its integration into traditional financial system, if you think about what's happening now with the crises around the world and all these kind of countries that are being shut off from, the financial networks, Bitcoin is valuable because it has no intermediaries, because it has no protections, because it does encourage radical self-sovereignty. And so I think a lot of people are interested in kind of the financial appreciation of Bitcoin, but are less interested in really the sovereignty that comes with it, which I think is the reason that gives it value in the first place. And so, yeah, I would say for anybody who is looking into self-custody, first of all, consider Unchained. It's the shameless plug there.
Sure.
But two, beyond that is just really understand, right, like how you're custodying your Bitcoin. And I can kind of distill that down into really, I would say, three, areas that I like to focus on with clients. And one of them is operational security, right? Which is just how are you holding your Bitcoin, right? What device are you using? What does your seed phrase backup look like? Do you have redundancy built in, and that you have kind of fail safes if something were to go wrong? I would say emergency recovery, right? What happens in this particular case if you're in, self-custody on your own with just one hardware wallet, right? Do I have a plan of action in case, like Joel, I've got water flooded into my house and, something goes wrong? Do I have a backup there? And, the last one I would also say, which I like to pay particular attention to, because I think it's one that a majority of the community neglects, is inheritance, right? Which is doing all of this work for my family. I have this low time preference. I'm intentionally depriving myself of kind of, the luxuries and you would say, and while I'm young, to kind of build this foundation for my family, but I haven't really actually considered how they're going to get a hold of it, right? And so I think a lot of people who are in self-custody, lack, I would say, proper titling for their Bitcoin, right? And that a lot
When
of
you say titling, what do you mean? Because I'm with you. I'm one of those people who's not thought about that. They know the seed phrase, they can just grab it and take it, was my assumption. But I'm guessing that's kind of, is that incorrect in that sense? Or
I mean, functionally, right? We could get the Bitcoin to them if they have their seed phrase. They're able to access it. But then the question, which then is begged from that setup, is basically how do they use it, right? In that there could be all sorts of taxable implications there. There could be all sorts of issues with this not being recorded legally or publicly. And I think a lot of Bitcoiners tend to kind of beat their chest and stand on the fact that they're contrarian or that they exist outside the system, and and that the same way, right, that in future, what is the old meme? It's like when you have to pay taxes on your Bitcoin, you won't have to, and the idea is that just the government won't be around, there won't be any taxes. And while I share that sentiment, and I definitely am not a fan of taxes, I also think at the same time that that's a little bit of a naive view of the perspective.
100%.
And I think a lot of people don't realize, in particular, when it comes to assets and passing them down through inheritance, is that if you don't have these assets properly titled in what I would say in like a will or a trust structure or something like that, and even in a will, this could go to probate court, right? Which is, once you pass, those assets, pass legally to someone else. But if you haven't determined who those assets are going to through a proper channel, well, then you end up in local probate court, contesting, the ownership of your own assets. And so that's public. So it's public record. So all the Bitcoin that you've passed down now becomes a matter of public record that everyone can see. So all the privacy element that you were concerned about is kind of out the window. And then two, you really have to worry about who's actually going to receive title to that, right? What if Bitcoin does what we expect it to do and it becomes the monetary reserve asset and it goes to $10 million a coin, or with Saylor, $21 million a coin over the next 21, years, who's going to come trying to get my Bitcoin? And so I think that, it's important to think about that titling aspect, not necessarily that you're, I would say capitulating to the traditional financial system, but you're planning for a world in which Bitcoin is actually integrated into the everything that we live and breathe and do nowadays.
That's a good point. I want to reiterate on the probate thing. When I was doing my estate plan update recently, I would say within the last 6 months, and I remember researching probate court. And if I'm not mistaken, it's almost like being in a litigation where you have to hire a lawyer and they go in and they take a percentage of your estate's assets. And it's easily avoidable by just simply creating a trust and, a proper will and structure and all that stuff, which isn't, it's complicated, but it's not as overwhelming as you would think. I always thought like a trust was like some corporation, like an LLC that you had to file with the state or something. And it's literally just like a document you and your spouse sign together and get notarized. And it's actually, I mean, again, it's super complicated, but depending on what type of assets and structure you have, but basically it's simple. It's just a piece of paper you notarize. And, but if you don't do it, you have to go and you have to fight the living crap out of the government, to get your stuff. And I don't know, it sounds like a real hassle. It sounds expensive and something I hope nobody ever has to go through. I've been to DMV.
Yeah.
That's exactly it, right? When the suits come knocking, you never know what they're going to take. What is that old Ronald Reagan line that says there's no, scarier phrase in the human language than I'm here from the government and I'm here to help,
Yep.
And so the least that you can interact with them, the better. And so, the reason that I mention that is because people that I talk with, they don't really have a plan in place. And I would say beyond that too, I mean, Bitcoin is still a nascent asset, a nascent industry, and a lot of the traditional legal professionals who have been around doing this for a long time are not familiar with Bitcoin, right? So how do you find an attorney that also knows what they're talking about, that gives you a trust structure that's going to hold up in court, that's going to really kind of iterate what your wishes are for your proof of work? And one of the easiest ways, again, another shameless plug, right, for Unchained, is that, you set up with a personal account, you're able to have self-custody of your Bitcoin, but we also offer TOD beneficiaries, which is, for those unfamiliar, it stands for transfer on death beneficiaries. And it's commonly used in bank accounts, commonly used in individual brokerage accounts and things like that. But it basically avoids the probate process in every state except for Louisiana. I don't know what the type of voodoo is going on down there, but every state besides Louisiana avoids the probate process. And
it's like a California thing. Like you wouldn't expect that in
Right.
Louisiana, but California would definitely be like the first state to make it, Bitcoin is illegal.
Yep.
Yeah, well, they'd find a way that you have to, transfer it into a custodial account and then you can access it, or something dumb. But yeah, TOD beneficiaries are an easy way, right? That you can have self custody and also title your assets and kind of just set that off by the wayside for $250 a year. So the other side of that inheritance too, which I think is equally important, and I don't think I did a very good job of properly framing it in the beginning, but it's also the transfer of possession, right? Which I think is what a majority of people solve for, which is go buy a BitKey, if you go to Casa, or if you go to or say you have your own little cipher, or as a lot of Bitcoiners do, right? They've got their buddy that they're going to call up and help. And so I really, encourage people to take a look at that, right? To really sit down and think about it from all different angles, if you're spending all this time working on it, right? You got to solve for both of those. You got to solve for title and possession. So
proof of work is not just Bitcoin, it's also estate planning.
Yeah. Unfortunately. Without a doubt, the hardest part of my job has to do with all the pieces that aren't Bitcoin. But it's a worthy endeavor for sure.
Okay, so here's a question about custody. How does institutional grade custody remove risk from self custody? And are there any ways that it adds risk? And I'll give you an example. Like when I listen to these podcasts about Bitcoin, like we're all obsessed with because we're maxis. Well, not all of us, but some of us. Kellen, we love you, dude. But like, I always wonder, like, okay, well, to me, a wallet's like, all right, you have your own, you have your key, it's like having your own wallet. Like you can arm yourself with a gun, like you at least have some sort of control over like a wrench attack, or like, having it in a vault or something somewhere that's behind key, et cetera. Like there's a lot of ways you can do it. Now you wonder about like, okay, institutions remove some risk to some degree, but in some ways they could add it. Like I always worry about like, what would happen if I had an institutional grade custodian and they went bankrupt? Like, how does that work? What are what are their terms of service? Like, what, do I get my, do I get my custody back? So I worry about those type of things because I lost a lot of, and excuse me, but I had crypto assets tied up in not BlockFi, but Celsius.
Yeah, Celsius.
Or sorry, Voyager. And man, I got beat up pretty hard on that because of course when they sold them, you got like the lowest, sale price, and you recovered certain percentage of your assets, but I definitely lost a lot of time and money, and I was really pissed. So that kind of put a little bit of a traumatic flair. So how does institutional grade custody remove risk from self custody, and are there ways that it adds risk? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. And then whenever you kind of went down that train in the first place, the first thing that popped into my mind was Celsius, BlockFi, Voyager Digital, all the countless FTX, countless examples of this, right? And really the key is your exposure to counterparty risk, right? And this goes back to kind of the first point that I was making, and the pathways that people are kind of given whenever they get into Bitcoin, custodial or self custody, right? And certainly there are plenty of downsides associated with custodial Bitcoin, as plenty of people have figured out in the past, and as Prime Trust is figuring out right now. And so, really, I would say is an analysis of that counterparty risk, right? And what I mean by that is not necessarily like, don't go pick an institution, put it in their hands, and say, okay, it's in an institution hands, I'm protected, right? Because the reality is that Bitcoin is a scarce and it's a finite asset, right? There's only going to be 21 million of these coins, and a lot of those people who ended up in those scenarios with BlockFi and Celsius and Voyager had the kind of security that, one, they were getting yield, which is a separate conversation that we can go in a little bit later. But also at the same time, they had this idea that, I'm safe, I'm with a company. And the reality is that, ultimately these companies don't have your best interest at heart. They're not always built with the same type of metal that you are, or the philosophy that you are, and that this is going to be a long enduring asset. And oftentimes they're just seeking kind of the, quick wins, right? The incremental yield that they can make off of your business. And so I would approach this from the perspective of like, how much sovereignty do I have? And if, I don't have any sovereignty, what is the structure of which the institutions are using to secure my funds, right? And so this goes to, like Coinbase Prime, in which, it's kind of just sitting in a vault, with Coinbase. But in reality, Coinbase is kind of, oftentimes the sole entity that has control over that vault, right? Which means that, if they wanted to put their hand in the cookie jar, they could. There's nothing that really prevents them, besides legal ramifications, which oftentimes, is dependent on how you can hold someone accountable. That is dependent on how much money and time you have. And so you want to avoid those situations. And so again, on Unchained, we use what we call our lead model, which is, it's self-custody. Our clients hold 2 keys. Unchained holds 1 key. There are 3 keys in total, and any combination of 2 keys is necessary to access the funds. And so you could say that that's institutional custody, but at its kind of more granular level, it's really your self-custody with Unchained as a helper, right? In case something goes wrong, like we were talking about in the past. And so I would say that,
So question on that to dig deeper. So like say you were in a situation to get extreme, if like say a couple that has an Unchained account, right? So, it's a husband and wife and something happens to them, like a fatal car crash or, whatever. And, there's one key left. And obviously there's an inheritance plan to send that maybe to the children or to, a guardian. How does that work in terms of like, is that Bitcoin lost forever because two of the keys just burned up in that car crash? Or I know that's a totally extreme example, but we are talking about, estate planning. So.
No, I mean, yeah. Kaylin, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, I was just gonna say no. I don't even think that's that extreme. That was kind of going down the same, or thought wise, thinking the exact same thing. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, well, first of all, what I would say is that if you have both of your keys and seed phrases in the car and you get in a car crash and it burns up, that was bad operational security. You shouldn't have both of your keys and seed phrases in the same car when you're traveling. But kind of in that instance, right? Unchained gives you a lot of redundancy, and that what I mean is you have two keys, and I've always got them conveniently placed right here nearby, so we can do kind of visual examples. But these are what you call key pairs, right? Client has two key pairs, Unchained has one, and any combination of two keys is necessary to access the funds. And so client can always unilaterally move Bitcoin on their own via the two keys that they have. But in the scenario that something goes wrong, right, what we recommend to our clients is that you've got these in two different places, right? You've got one inside of your house. You've got one maybe at a safety deposit box at a bank or at a trusted family member's house. And then you've got your inheritance protocol set up, which is what I have here, which is where you've made a copy of one of those two seed phrases and you put it inside the protocol and you've given it to an executor or to a beneficiary or something like that, who's going to be the person who's going to receive the Bitcoin once you pass. And so you've got a much more redundancy here than like if you were in single sig on your own. And what I mean by that is that, if you were to have a fire at one location and you were to lose this key, well, the idea is that, this key is still operational. It's still okay. Unchained has, the other key, which means we still have the two keys to access the funds. In particular, one nuance that I like to mention about people who are interested in multi-sig that kind of makes them more interested in the idea is the plausible deniability associated with it as well. In that, say, even if I was in, self-custody on my own and I had one key and I had, say, a backup of my seed phrase somewhere else, well, if someone stumbles upon that seed phrase that I have my backup somewhere else, even if that's more redundant than just having a copy of one of my seed phrases, well, it becomes a single point of failure, because if that person takes that seed phrase, puts it into a device, that device is going to show them the full Bitcoin balance, right? They're going to have the key to access it and then they can take it. So in those scenarios, you have to be really, really granular and really focused on not exposing that seed phrase to anybody, surrounding me. And I always say that's generally best practice advice. But in multi-sig, you've got a little bit of a difference here in that there are, instead of one piece of information, the seed phrase, being able to access the Bitcoin, there are three pieces of information that someone would need to unilaterally access the funds. And I call those the big three. And those are two keys of any combination, whether or not that's, your two keys or one of your keys in Unchained. And then what we call the wallet configuration file, or what I refer to it as is the treasure map. And so it's the treasure map to your treasure chest, which if we go back to the digital vault analogy, kind of makes sense there. But that wallet configuration file is the file that trains the Bitcoin network to look for a balance associated with multiple seed phrases or multiple keys. And so if someone doesn't have that, and say this seed phrase is at my buddy's house or at a safety deposit box, and Uncle Sam comes and opens up my safety deposit box, and they take the seed phrase out and they put it into a device. Well, if they don't have that wallet configuration file, this device is going to try to natively return the balance associated with a single seed phrase, which ideally is zero. And so they can't see how much Bitcoin you have, first of all, which increases your privacy. But also beyond that, it also, even if they could see how much Bitcoin you have, it's only one of the three keys, so they can't move it. So you've got layers to this thing, right? And really the difference between, a 2 of 3 multi-sig with a collaborative custody partner like Unchained and, self-custody on your own, the only real difference is an additional device, right?
Can you guys be subpoenaed in any type of sense and be forced to provide that second key in a situation like that? I don't know if that's something that's ever came up. And I know that's more nefarious and you guys aren't trying to get in bed with nefarious actors in the first place, but I'm just curious, has there ever been a horror story like that?
We like hypotheticals as Bitcoiners.
Yes, hypotheticals.
We do like hypotheticals, right? We're all about hypotheticals. So there has not been an instance of that that I'm aware of that Unchained has ever been, lawfully subpoenaed to provide a client's information. I guess it becomes a question, and my legal team might not like this, but whether or not we would cooperate in that scenario. But
For sure.
saying that we did cooperate and we had to cooperate, this kind of goes back to what I was talking about in regards to counterparty risk and how the structure of your custody is set up. Is that even if Unchained were compelled to lawfully,
you only have one key, right?
We only have one key, right?
Yeah.
And so the client still has two keys, and so you're in a position of power. You're in a position of sovereignty, and so that's Unchained intentionally does that in a manner to protect our clients, but also to protect ourselves in that we're not able to put our hands in the cookie jar, right? We're not able to in times of trying financial circumstances or bear markets, to stick our hands in the cookie jar and then increase the risk profile for our clients. And so it's all about how your collaborative custody partner structures this, right? It's all about the actual model itself. It's not about choosing a name that sounds good. It's about, choosing a structure that actually gives you the power. And so that's what I encourage for people is to really dive into those models and not implicitly trust a name brand for anything. I'll call something out specifically. I do like Fidelity, but Fidelity is kind of the most, I would say, advanced traditional financial platform for Bitcoin. But at the same time, if you go look at like their arbitrary restrictions on their platform, you've got, if you wanted to withdraw, when you've got withdrawal limits, and then two, you've also got, like a certain amount of whitelisted addresses that you can actually send Bitcoin to, which to anyone who's an experienced Bitcoiner knows that if I'm sending Bitcoin over and over to the same addresses, I'm reducing my privacy on chain. Yeah. And so
question on that, because I have a Fidelity Roth IRA set for me and my wife. So, let's just say I may or may not have bought some Bitcoin and converted, some of those assets over to that literally the second I discovered that you could. So are you able to, so did I understand right? You're saying that you're able to actually withdraw Bitcoin from Fidelity, say when you're retiring, because it's like a Roth, right? And there's no RMD on it. So at some point you could just be like, oh, I've got X amount of Bitcoin in here.
So I want to pause there because I'm not familiar with Fidelity's distribution capability.
Okay. Whether or not I didn't think so. I thought you had to sell it.
I don't know if that's the case. Subtle plug here with Unchained, you could take distributions in Bitcoin with us, which you apparently can't do with Fidelity. But I was more referring to their individual brokerage, their Fidelity crypto account where you're storing personal funds. So, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so if I opened up a Roth IRA through Unchained, I could technically withdraw the Bitcoin when it's time to withdraw the Bitcoin.
Yep. Yeah, you can.
That's awesome. Oh my God.
Well, and not only that, Joel, but you can hold the keys to it too, right? You can hold a priority quorum of keys and be in control. And the way we structure it is that everything that Unchained does is backwards compatible, which means that you can take the vault that we help you build, you rebuild it in open source software, and then the worst case scenario, Unchained, Austin, Texas gets hit by a meteor, we go out of business. You've got your two keys to access the Bitcoin, and then also beyond that, our IRA is custodied at Fortis Bank, which means you're still in good standing with the IRS because we're not the legal custodian of the IRA, and so you're just in a much better position, right? A much better sovereign position.
You asked all of my risk questions about like what happens if a meteor hits your headquarters, and what happens if what happens if this, and what happens if that, and you literally just bred my brain. So.
Well, and on the note of the Roth RIAs and stuff, like, can you tell us what the difference is from the Roth that you guys offer and just a Roth in general compared to some of the more traditional retirement funds like a 401k or things along that line? Like, why should people go that route with you guys?
Yeah, and it's kind of the conversation we just talked about, right? In that, there are a variety of different ways that you can get Bitcoin exposure within a Roth, right, or within an IRA account. You could buy, ETF. There are some where you could actually do checkbook IRAs and hold the Bitcoin in a custodial account with an exchange. But really, I would say the value for Unchained is one, you can actually hold the keys to the Bitcoin. You're in control of it, right? Which is a vast disparity between the control that you have in every other IRA account. Anyone who's ever dealt with a 401k and wanted to transfer their funds before they left their employer or something like that knows what I'm talking about, and that you're severely restricted in the actual control you have for a lot of these funds. And so you have the control in an Unchained IRA. Now, that's not to say that you can just move the Bitcoin and spin it wherever you want to. We'll still do reporting on it. We'll report to our partner Fortis, and Fortis will report to the IRS if there were to be out of bound contributions or distributions. But ultimately, that control's within your hand. Within your hands. And,
do you have regular IRAs too? Because, for example, some people's income is too high, and they have that silly little backdoor trick rule for which is literally. It sounds complicated and, it sounds like intimidating, but it's literally like you have an IRA and a Roth IRA account. You just put your money in the IRA and pay taxes on it. You do it post-tax, and then you just transfer the account and then just tell your accountant like, hey, I did this. And they're like, oops, I guess I beat the income threshold for the Roth IRA.
Yep. Yeah. And then that's what is that? The dual tax code for those who know and those who don't.
Right. Right. I mean, anybody who makes money, I feel like spends an inordinate amount of time studying this stuff. At least I would hope so, because, protecting your wealth as you're accumulating it and trying to leave a legacy is like, it's like walking through, if you ever seen a Squid Game, where, they're jumping on those little platforms over that pit of spikes. It's literally what it's like. It's like, should I step on this one or should I step on this one? Okay, both of them could kill me, but I have to step because the bridge behind me is going to blow out.
Oh yeah. I think Jerome Powell would look pretty good in one of those masks,
Yeah.
running the Squid Games. But yeah, that's exactly it, right? Unchained has traditional, we have SEP, we have Roth, we have solo 401ks. You can transfer thrift saving plans. You can transfer all of those into an Unchained IRA.
Is it easy to transfer across institutions? So like, for example, if I had, a crypto Roth IRA at Fidelity, and I'm just like, you know what, guys, I want to actually custody what I may or may not have in there. Can, is that something I could just push a button and then fill out some paperwork or something?
It's a good point that you bring up, and that there are a variety of custodians who are willing to do what you call an in-kind transfer, which is where the Bitcoin is never liquidated. So it's never sent to cash, and then the cash is then sent to another custodian, and then the Bitcoin has to be repurchased, which leaves you, one, outside the market for a little bit of time, and also, two, is kind of subject to trading fees for liquidations on either end. And so I always encourage people, if you're with like a Swan Bitcoin, if you're with a Bitcoin IRA and I Trust Capital, forgive me, I'm not exactly sure about Fidelity. But if you are in those IRA structures and you're in a custodial account and you don't have access to it and you want to be in a more sovereign position, look into in-kind transfers. Because oftentimes a lot of those custodians are willing to facilitate the transfers where you don't have to sell the Bitcoin, and that makes that process just infinitely smoother.
What does that look like for people that may have a Roth with the traditional index funds or something in it? Are they going to have to go through those taxable events through the selling, transfer to cash, and then purchasing Bitcoin, or what does that look like?
So that's a good point. There is no taxable implications for trading inside of an IRA. And the reason is because the funds never leave the actual IRA unless you make a tremendous mistake, right? But if I were in an index fund and I were to sell it within the IRA, then that's not subject to capital gains tax, even if I'm up, because the funds are still within the tax advantaged account. They've never moved. And so for someone who is an index fund, right, you would have to liquidate. You'd have to go to cash. Sometimes they can do asset transfers and things like that. But generally you have to go to cash, and then you transfer that cash. That process is generally initiated by the receiving custodian. So the first step in that process is setting up an account with, the person, the company that you want to be the new custodian of the funds. In this case, could be Unchained, right? You'd set up the account and then file a transfer request form at the receiving custodian. And then that transfer request form is sent to your existing custodian, and that starts the process of releasing the funds. And so there is a wide disparity between how a lot of those traditional financial institutions facilitate those transfers. And then I've seen some of them take 3 days, and I've seen some of them take 3 months, right? And so really I encourage people that are in that process is one, if you have a former 401k with a former employer, those funds are generally able to be moved, and I would encourage you into looking into moving those, because oftentimes you're in a 401k structure, if you haven't carefully curated it, that you're paying an active management fee or some element of fee, which is just eroding your value and appreciation over time. And then two is that, if you're no longer with that employer, well, you get a say, you get to control where it goes. And so I encourage everyone who's in that scenario, you've ever left an employer, move it into somewhere that, is more favorable for you.
Yeah, I worked at a place for probably a year and a half, putting $20 a check into a HSA, just a simple health savings account. And I think by the end of it, I maybe had $250 in it, but I didn't realize they were charging $2.50 every month to send me the paperwork, like just telling me my balance. And now I don't get them anymore, so I'm assuming it's just ran out, because I never went through and used it. But it was like, oh, am I really going to spend this time for $150 to get everything moved over to something fresh, or what time efficient? Like it just didn't make sense to me. But it's interesting you touch on that point specifically, and earlier you were saying with the transfer of keys and the multi-sig that it doesn't allow you guys to dip your hand into the cookie jar. Well, how are you guys making your money on this? I know there's fees associated somewhere, so what does that fee structure look like? What events are you guys taking fees on? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's another great question, right? And so in the structure that you just outlined, right? A traditional financial institution will make their money by just charging you an active management fee, anywhere between 0.1% and 1%, oftentimes annually, and they'll pull that just directly out of the funds, and you won't even see that it's disappearing. And so with Unchained, we're restricted from being able to do that. To your point, right? We can't put our hand in the cookie jar. So we do have an invoice system that has to be paid via credit or debit card. And that can feel like there's some friction there for people who are wanting to set up an account that I have to pay it out of my credit or debit card. But the trade-off there, we find
get the Gemini card and get the Bitcoin rewards. I mean, come on, man.
There you go. But we see it as a favorable trade-off, right? In that you have to pay it out of kind of your dispensable income. But at the same time, the trade-off that you're getting is that, I don't have this, BIP system or percentage that is being taken out of the account every year that hampers your financial return. So that's, really the key. Unchained charges a $250 flat annual fee per account. That's not based on a percentage of holdings. So it's just a flat annual fee. If you have 1 Bitcoin, or if you have 10 Bitcoin or 200, it's the same, fee kind of up and down the road. But at the same time, we do charge and assess a trading fee. So whenever you're buying and converting, back and forth between Bitcoin, that's whenever you have a fee associated with the conversion. So.
Okay. What, so and you guys are able to keep track of that, since I've got 2 keys, if I'm doing any moving trading on my own front, making sure it's still staying in that fund, you guys just then invoice? Is that like a monthly situation, or is that just added into that yearly 250?
So in this instance, in trading, because you're doing a conversion, that's the one instance in which the fee can be taken out of the actual funds because they're in cash. And so, that's a frictionless process. But the actual account management fee is where it comes into credit or debit card. So
okay, cool. That makes sense.
Pay taxes on all those buy and sell events too. You got to be careful with that.
Keep them to a minimal, ideally.
If you sell in under a 1 year period, you get you could be income tax, and if you're kicking butt and you're making money, that could be like 40%. So your 100% gain just turned into a 60. It's like,
yeah, that's rough.
Bitcoin has always rewarded the hodlers. So long-term plays, and so what we see is that like Unchained is a really good situation for somebody who sees Bitcoin as a long-term asset, right? In that you get sovereignty over it, you got a way to transfer title and possession both. If we were to go out of business, you've got a way to recover it. The fee is manageable, $250 flat, and so you can buy and hold the Bitcoin for the 30 years that you're expecting for it to appreciate before you're able to use it as an asset that you're taking distributions against. It's one of the perfect ways to think with that low time preference mentality, and that's.
Do you guys do Bitcoin back loans? I forgot. I'm not sure if you do or you don't.
We do, yeah. So we do Bitcoin-backed loans. We do commercial Bitcoin-backed loans. So business entities are really the key there. The only business entity that's kind of exempt from that is sole proprietorships. We just don't work with those. So you do need some type of corporate entity, whether it's an S corp, C corp, LLC, something like that. But yeah, you're certainly able to take the Bitcoin, put it up for collateral, and receive dollars to access some of that liquidity.
Do you think you'll ever have plans to do individuals? Because I think about, like, let's just say somebody had some Bitcoin locked up with you, and it's 20 years from now, and let's say Sailor's right, and they're sitting on a mighty stack here, and you're their custody companion. So, and they're just like, you know what? I just want to harvest the appreciation. It's part of my estate plan. I'm going to borrow against it right now and step it up when it passes on to the kids. I wonder. So, do you think that'll ever show up with you guys?
Whatever show up is the key word there. I would say Unchained did do personal loans for a very long time, through kind of the origination of the company. In fact, the multi-sig model for, custody actually derived from Unchained's original product, which was, the Bitcoin-backed loans, in which the collateral is held between three different entities, and kind of the 2 of 3 structure that we were discussing. And so one key is held by Unchained, one key is held by the borrower, and then one key is held by an institutional key agent. So you can always verify on chain that you actually, via the key that you have, that the Bitcoin is sitting there and hasn't been rehypothecated, or I would say obligated to other financial situations, for a lack of a better word there, which is really what caused the problem with FTX and Celsius and BlockFi and stuff like that, was that you were putting your Bitcoin up for yield, and what you didn't realize is that you were the yield, because they were taking the Bitcoin and they were giving it for Bitcoin-backed loans, and then the market tanked and those loans got liquidated, and then it feeds back into itself. They can't repay the loans. When the loans can't be repaid, they can't pay the yield, and then it just becomes a whole debacle and blows up. So yeah, Unchained, we've done personal loans in the past. Right now we do commercial loans, but we do it from the perspective of de-risking, right? And what I mean by that is that, if you have $10,000 minimums on Bitcoin-backed loans, and you have personal indication where you can just take a personal loan, everybody and their mom is going to take a Bitcoin-backed loan, without really, I would say, the proper understanding of the recourse in those scenarios, and that if the price tanks, you can be liquidated, right? And the Bitcoin collateral is taken. And so I wouldn't say that we're averse to doing it ever again. But at the same time, we have no recent plans to do so, because what we found, having done this and actually being the oldest lender on the market, person who actually pioneered the no rehypothecation model, is that people that do that are just kind of asking for a beating a lot of the times. So we intentionally structure our thresholds and the way that we've done our loans in order to best fit the client, to protect them. So
that's nice to hear from a custody company. Yeah, like that. That's nice, because I've always been pretty weary of just the Bitcoin-backed loan, crypto-backed loans in general, especially the whole FTX, Celsius, like the whole era of it when we were seeing it happen in real time. So that's genuinely nice to hear coming from you guys. And you're right. I think it is, like, if the people that are willing to put themselves in that position for those smaller amounts, especially, are almost always going to be liquidated in those scenarios. It's going to be something they run into.
Yeah, and so this kind of fits back into the long-term mentality of Unchained, is that if we're going to offer an inheritance service, we've got to be around whenever you pass away.
Yep.
And so we're not going to cut corners and take the easy wins at the expense of the longevity and security of our clients. So
it's nice.
Yeah, that's awesome. So one question here for miners, because we do have a lot of people who are mining Bitcoin that watch this, well, hopefully still mining Bitcoin right now in this little price dip. So I'm assuming you obviously work with a lot of Bitcoin holders. Do you notice any custody approaches that are different from non-miners?
Different from non-miners. Would you mind qualifying that a little bit more?
Yeah. So, for example, like your individual clients versus some of the miners that you have, and obviously you might have some publics, you might have some private miners, et cetera, because mining is a business, right? I would feel like those types of clients may take their custody way more seriously and have way more robust plans than simply the the typical Bitcoin holder that comes in and they're like, oh, what do I do with this? I don't want this responsibility, or I want to diversify my risk. So do you see any like technical things in the approach that, like the miners do in terms of how they approach it, that I think anybody who doesn't have, what am I trying to say? Let me try rephrasing that. Sometimes you know how it is, just running yourself in circles. So I guess what I mean is, like, the miners are obviously going to have very, very strict custody protocols. Is there anything from that world that the individual Bitcoiner should be thinking about?
Yeah. So I think this kind of, bleeds into, how do I take my operations to the next level, right? One, if I'm a miner, and then also, two, on an individual perspective, how can I emulate some of the things that some of the big dogs are doing, right? To kind of take advantage of those models myself. And what I would say is that all of this is dependent on, one, the structure of the business, and then two, your appetite for, being a part of the quorum and holding the keys on your own, and internal and external stakeholders, LPs, and things like that. And so there's quite a variety there. What I would say is that our lead model, which is the model we've talked about mostly for this podcast, which is the 2 of 3 model, is sufficient for a lot of smaller operations, I would say, and that maybe I've got 1 or 2 people involved that are actually involved in the financial aspect of things. But then you've also got operations that have varying thresholds of stakeholders that are involved in actually approving transactions. So that's kind of leads into, like, maybe a 2 of 3 model isn't the ideal setup, right? Maybe a 3 of 5, or maybe a 2 of 4, depending on their appetite, and then also whether or not how many technical individuals I have on my team. So we have something called like an approver quorum, which is also able to be utilized in our trust accounts and other accounts for individuals. That if I'm not a technical individual and I don't want to hold a key, and maybe I don't want a 3 of 5 quorum, I don't want to be actually on chain, I can actually, approve transactions at the software layer, right? Where, someone signs a transaction, it pings me, and then I go in, I'm able to, determine whether or not this is something that, I want to approve or deny. And you have a threshold there within the approver quorum, just like you have a threshold in the, base multi-sig quorum. So I could have a, 2 of 3, multi-sig setup where 2 people hold keys and Unchained holds the third. And then that could send to an approver quorum where, say, there's 5 people involved, and I have a threshold of 3 of 5 that have to approve those transactions, or it could be 5 of 5 or whatever I want. But I do encourage people to think about, the people that they want involved in these quorums, and what levels they want people involved, how much access they have, and really, kind of think about, including people in these models where you're more protected, right, from bad actors. And that, if I have a 3 of 5, and one of those key holders becomes a bad actor, well, then I still have a sufficient quorum to be able to move the Bitcoin away from that key holder and kick them out of the model with really little that they could do to prevent it. But also at the same time, also how much access and control I want my custodian to have, right? Because, at Unchained, we've got the 2 of 3 model. We've got, the what we call flexible quorums, where you can kind of construct how many keys you want in the threshold of the quorum. The approver quorum, which is a software layer on top of that. Then we've got, Gannett Trust, which is our sister company, a Wyoming-based trust company, that utilizes Unchained's infrastructure, but, is also perfect for people who are looking for trust administration, right? For people who are, looking to have their heirs and, the people who are going to be recipients of their Bitcoin inheritance not have to necessarily be too familiar with the, actual underworkings or underpinnings of how the technical aspects of Bitcoin work. But maybe a 2 of 4 is a good scenario for a client like that, where the beneficiaries have 2 keys, so they still have good sovereignty. They can move the Bitcoin away from Gannett, with the 2 keys, but also at the same time, Gannett could hold a key and Unchained could hold a key. And they've got 2 keys. So if you're looking for distributions out to your heirs, well, then they can run the operational aspects of the trust, right? But all of these, kind of come with trade-offs, right? The 2 of 4, you're giving implicit control, to Gannett and Unchained, and, in the approver quorum, the person isn't actually on the base chain holding the quorum. So there's all these trade-offs. And so that's what I encourage, people, and the very, kind of bring this full circle, right, is to know your custody arrangement, right? Know how it functions, know what you're going to do with inheritance, emergency recovery, and operational security. And so with Unchained, we try to give you the white glove service. The first step in any of these accounts or any of these setups is a consultation with one of our team members where we're going to sit down and we're going to individually assess, your situation, and not only, your technical capabilities and all that stuff, and whether or not you want to hold keys, but also what are your preferences? What do you want? What does your ultimate life look like? And so I think a lot of people sacrifice the sovereignty of Bitcoin in those custodial accounts because they like the convenience. And there's, maybe a little bit more friction in the initial setup because we got to kind of think through it together and how we want to structure it. But in the long run with Unchained, you're in a much more powerful position. And so it's trade-offs like everything else.
Well, we're going to wrap up soon. So I want to maybe leave with one final question here, kind of like topic, and that is like best practices. Of course, every single person's situation is different, but for the sake of argument, if we had to generalize, what do you think would be like the best, the best set of practices a person, for example, like where's the best place to store your seed phrase, et cetera. What best practices would you recommend to somebody who's like, hey, I want to come in, get like a vault with an Unchained, how do you protect that stuff? How do you minimize things like wrench attacks and all that stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. So what I would say is these kind of bleed into each other. But for the person who is in single sig on their own, what I would say is always have a backup to your seed phrase, right? And that sounds pretty simple, but it's something I feel like always needs to be reiterated.
Mm-hmm.
Have a backup to your seed phrase. And then also at the same time, think about what's going to affect me, right? So if I have fires, maybe I'm considering a fireproof bag or a titanium steel plate. Maybe I'm considering having my backup somewhere else, geographically distributed. But at Unchained, we try to make it relatively easy in that, because of what we mentioned previously and the kind of layers to access Bitcoin in a multi-sig quorum. If someone doesn't have the wallet configuration file, well, then the seed phrase that they stumble upon is kind of worthless. So in that case, really the key is geographical segregation, right? Put them in two separate locations, put one in your house, put one in maybe a safety deposit box or a trusted family member's house. But the idea is that if I had a fire, I'm not going to lose all of them at the same time. And it's just really as simple as that. It's, you add one additional key onto a single sig setup and you've got that redundancy that you need. And so that would,
out with my banker once over my safety deposit box at one of the banks I bank at. I was like, okay, well, what happens if this branch fails? Because I'm thinking in my head, being a Bitcoiner, I'm like, if I were to put a seed phrase in this, because obviously you wouldn't want to keep something like that on you, and you wouldn't want to keep something like that at home, and it makes it very, very hard for somebody to coerce you, because it's kind of like, no one's going to walk you into a bank through security. So it's like, what happens? And it turns out that the banks, if something happens to you, or, like so you pass away, or if, something happens to the branch, they have an obligation. They have a certain distribution hierarchy of things that they need to do, or order of processes that they have to do in order to make sure that somebody gets that, that's supposed to have it. So for example, your spouse. So that to me was interesting, because that was the first thing I was worried about. I was like, okay, well, if you get a Bitcoin wallet, or, what if you keep it in a bank safety deposit box? Okay, well, what happens if something happens to that particular branch? How do you get it? Or what happens if something happens to me? How does my spouse get it? So I don't know. I feel like these types of questions and thought processes can drive you absolutely insane. I've spent way too much time thinking about this. And of course, there's pros and cons to everything. There's no such thing as risk-free in custody, but there is definitely, risk mitigation. So anything else you got, Kalen?
Man, I think that about covers it up. I was super happy to be able to sit down and talk to you and really dive into some of the more retirement plan side of things. That's something I'm really interested in personally. So I was happy that you were able to share some foresight on that. And I think your guys' multi-sig solution is something that the industry's needed, or that you guys have been around for a while, but it's something that is needed in the industry, and it's something that I don't think enough people know about, and I'm glad to be able to help get that message out there a little bit more. So I think it's something that anybody with any amount, that if you've got it locked up and you're self-custodying yourself, it's like, why not take that extra step into something more meaningful, especially if you're looking into an inheritance, or if you're trying to pass this down.
Yeah. That's exactly to the point, Kayla. And what we like to say is, when you get serious, come to Unchained.
So. Yep. I like that.
Excellent, Matt. Thank you so much for your time. You're always such a wealth of knowledge, and it always, every time I've ever talked to you, it always gives me so much to think about and reflect on. So again, thank you for coming on and doing with us. It's been great.
I say ditto, Joel. Thank you for having me. You guys are awesome. And, for all the people out there, I'll leave it at this. Now is a phenomenal time to buy Bitcoin.
Yes.
I'm with it.
Will not regret it. So
I think that's a good note to finish it up on. Thanks for everybody checking in. We'll talk to y'all next time. Bye.